The greatest biography ever written about Andrew Carnegie is David Nasaw's Andrew Carnegie, a monumental 878-page study of the man who built the largest steel empire the world had ever seen. And the deeper you go into that book and into the earlier works by Joseph Waugh and Burton Hendrick, the clearer something becomes. Carnegie wasn't simply a businessman. He wasn't merely ambitious or lucky or ruthlessly efficient. He had a logic, a mental architecture that shaped every decision he made from the time he was a poor immigrant boy working in Pittsburgh. Textile mill to the day he sold Carnegie Steel to J.P. Morgan for what would become roughly $400 billion in today's dollars. Before we dive in, make sure you subscribe, because every week we study the minds of history's greatest builders and extract the principles that actually move civilizations forward. Here's the thing about Carnegie. His story often gets flattened into a cliché. The rags to riches tale. The classic Gilded Age titan. The man who went from bobbin boy to steel king. But that misses the real point. The real story is about how Carnegie thought, how he processed opportunity, risk, technology, labor, and timing with an intensity of logic that made him more like a grandmaster in a decades-long chess match than a typical industrialist. When you trace his life chronologically, a fascinating pattern emerges. Carnegie always believed that the most important asset in the world was not land, not machines, not factories, and not even steel. It was information, the right information, gathered at the right time, interpreted with the right logic. And this belief formed the psychological foundation of his empire. He learned that lesson young. As a teenage telegraph operator in Pittsburgh, he realized he had a secret advantage no one else around him possessed. He could listen in on the flow of national business in real time. Every message passing through that telegraph station told him something about railroad expansions, market prices, freight traffic, political movements, industrial demand. While other boys his age were chasing comfort, Carnegie was memorizing patterns. He was building the first layer of his lifelong strategy. Always get to the information before everyone else. But something deeper was happening in his mind. Carnegie wasn't simply absorbing facts. He was learning to identify bottlenecks, the friction points in American industry. Railroads needed stronger rails. Machinery needed better materials. Bridges needed greater structural integrity. The entire industrial world was straining against the limits of iron-based technology. Carnegie could feel something coming, a shift, a break, a transformation. And this is what separates him from his contemporaries. While most men of the era were comfortable operating within the boundaries of what already existed, Carnegie was training himself to anticipate what must exist next. Steel wasn't inevitable. Steel was the logical solution to a nation growing too fast for its own materials. By the time Carnegie entered the steel business in his 30s, he wasn't chasing an opportunity. He was completing a logical equation that he'd been solving since his telegraph days. And every decision he made from that moment forward flowed from that same foundation. Gather the information, identify the bottleneck, and then scale aggressively into the solution before anyone else even understands the problem. That's how Andrew Carnegie operated. And once you see the pattern, the rise of the steel empire stops looking like luck and starts looking like inevitability. When Carnegie finally stepped into the world of steel, he didn't enter it as a gambler hoping for a lucky break. He entered it as a man who had already solved the equation in his mind. Every industry he had worked in before, railroads, bridges, telegraphy, ironworks, had pointed to the same conclusion. America was expanding too fast for traditional materials. Its infrastructure was creaking under the weight of its own ambition. Its railroads were snapping. Its bridges were failing. Its factories were constrained by brittle iron that simply could not handle the velocity of a rising industrial empire. Steel wasn't just a material, it was the missing infrastructure of the future. And Carnegie understood this long before most of his competitors knew the revolution had even started. But his genius wasn't simply in seeing the opportunity. It was in how he executed on it. Carnegie operated with a single, ruthless, elegant principle that he repeated all his life. And biographers highlight it because it appears so often in his letters and decisions. Control your costs, and you control your destiny. That idea shaped every steel mill he built, every process he modified, every partnership he kept, and every technological innovation he pushed into production. In the early 1870s, while other iron masters were content with incremental efficiency, Carnegie did something different. He traveled, he studied, he went to England to investigate the Bessemer process firsthand, the revolutionary method that could turn molten iron into steel in mere minutes. Most American manufacturers saw Bessemer as risky, unstable, unreliable. Carnegie saw something else. He saw speed. And to him, speed was more than convenience. Speed was cost reduction. Speed was competitive annihilation. Speed was destiny, before other investors even understood the magnitude of the shift. Carnegie committed to Bessemer Steel with the intensity of a man placing a bet on the entire future of the nation. And he wasn't wrong. The timing was perfect. Railroads were exploding across the continent. Cities were rising vertically for the first time. Bridges were spanning rivers previously thought too wide. America wasn't just growing. It was transforming. And Carnegie positioned himself at the very heart of that transformation. But here's what really made his empire unstoppable. He didn't just build steel mills. He built a vertically integrated machine. He owned the ore fields. He owned the ships. He owned the rail lines. He owned the furnaces. He controlled every link in the chain, from the raw material on the ground to the finished beam in a skyscraper. By stripping away every unnecessary middleman and compressing the distance between extraction and production, he eliminated the biggest drain on profit, inefficiency. When his competitors faced rising prices, Carnegie maintained stability. When others struggled to scale, he expanded aggressively. When they hesitated to modernize, he rebuilt entire mills from scratch. He was relentless in the pursuit of efficiency, because efficiency meant lower costs, lower prices, and absolute dominance. Nasaw writes that Carnegie improved a process even when there was no immediate need, simply because the logic of cost demanded it. If something could be cheaper tomorrow, then the current method was already obsolete. This wasn't business intuition. This was industrial logic applied with mathematical precision. Steel wasn't just a commodity to Carnegie, it was a system, and systems can be mastered. As you follow Carnegie chronologically through his rise, a pattern becomes unmistakable. He didn't build the most powerful steel empire in the world simply because he embraced new technology. He built it because he understood something deeper. Technology is useless unless paired with organization, and Carnegie's ability to organize an industrial system was unparalleled. What he created inside his mills wasn't a factory, it was a living organism. Every part moved in harmony, every minute had a purpose. Every delay was treated like an infection spreading through the body of the enterprise, and Carnegie took personally the responsibility of removing anything that slowed progress. He would rewrite procedures overnight. He would reorganize management without hesitation. He would reinvest profits constantly, refusing to let capital sit idle for even a moment. He famously said that the greatest mistake a businessman could make was to pull money out of his operations. In his mind, capital that wasn't compounding was capital that was dying. He practiced what he called the gospel of cost. If a machine became outdated, he replaced it immediately. If a furnace could be redesigned to save a few cents on fuel, he approved it without debate. His managers often complained that he rebuilt his mills so frequently, they never had time to get used to the old layout before a new one arrived. But that was the point. In Carnegie's worldview, the enemy of industrial greatness was stagnation. Every improvement created a new baseline. Every baseline demanded to be surpassed. This attitude created an internal culture at Carnegie Steel that historians still study today. It was a culture built on measurement. Carnegie wanted numbers for everything. Tonnage per day, fuel usage per hour, scrap percentage per batch, labor cost per ton, downtime minutes per shift. If something could be measured, it could be improved. If it could be improved, it could be made profitable. His obsession with data gave him the power to see inefficiencies long before other companies even knew they existed. But there was another side to Carnegie's logic, the human side. He built a network of young, extremely capable managers whom he trained personally. He called them his young men, and they ran the mills with an intensity that mirrored his own. Hendrick, Charles Schwab, Georges Lauder, these were not ordinary managers. They were industrial strategists who understood Carnegie's system at a cellular level. Carnegie delegated not because he wanted more free time, but because he understood leverage. A single brilliant manager could multiply his reach 100-fold, and yet even with this powerful web of talent beneath him, Carnegie remained the brain of the organism. His managers executed, but he designed the game. When he sensed the market shifting, he made moves no one else dared make. During downturns, while competitors shut down production, Carnegie expanded. When others waited for a demand to return, he flooded the market with low-cost steel, driving them into bankruptcy. His logic was simple. If you control costs, you can survive any storm. And if you survive every storm, eventually you own the entire horizon. By the late 1890s, Carnegie's mills were not just productive, they were the most productive industrial complexes on Earth. And the gap between him and his competitors was no longer a competition. It was a canyon. By the time Carnegie entered the last decade of his career, the steel empire he had built was no longer just an industrial enterprise. It was a force of nature. And the most fascinating part is that this extraordinary dominance did not come from brute strength alone. It came from a worldview, a way of interpreting reality that Carnegie had refined since his teenage years in the telegraph office. Carnegie believed that every industry behaved like a living ecosystem. Prices shifted like weather patterns. Demand surged and receded like tides. Competitors rose and fell like species adapting or dying. But within this ecosystem, one thing was constant. The lowest cost producer always wins over time. If you could produce steel cheaper than anyone on Earth, then the future belonged to you. No panic could destroy you. No competitor could corner you. No recession could threaten you. You were unbreakable. And Carnegie built his organization around this one idea. It was the gravitational center of everything he did. Even when profits were soaring, he reinvested constantly. Not because he needed more capacity immediately, but because he understood something few businessmen ever grasped. The industry's battlefield wasn't the present. It was the future. And the only way to win the future was to prepare for it before it arrived. This is why he spent millions modernizing furnaces when other companies were only upgrading the most urgent components. Why he built massive new mills even in years when demand was flat. Why he drove his managers hard to find reductions in costs so small that other companies didn't even bother tracking them. Carnegie didn't chase margins. He created them. He didn't wait for the market to reward him. He forced the market to bend. One of the most impressive examples of his logic comes from the Homestead Works, the most advanced steel plant of its time. Carnegie ordered complete redesigns of its processes not once or twice, but continuously. When a new system made production a few cents cheaper per ton, he approved it instantly. When a method reduced waste by fractions of a percent, he implemented it without hesitation. His mills were never finished. They were always evolving, always accelerating, always adapting. This constant transformation was exhausting for everyone involved, but it was the engine of his empire. And then there was his uncanny ability to anticipate the psychology of the market. Carnegie understood that fear destroyed companies long before competition did. So when economic downturns struck, and they struck hard in the late 19th century, Carnegie behaved in a way that seemed insane to his rivals. While they cut production, he increased it. While they protected cash, he invested heavily. While they prayed for stability, he exploited their hesitation. He knew exactly what he was doing. When demand returned, his competitors would emerge weaker, poorer, and scared. Carnegie would emerge larger, cheaper, and unstoppable. This was not luck. This was logic refined, practiced, and applied with precision that bordered on mathematical certainty. And that logic was about to attract the attention of the one man powerful enough to alter the destiny of American industry, J.P. Morgan. As Carnegie's empire reached unimaginable scale, something inevitable happened. His dominance began pressing up against the other titans of American finance, men who didn't run factories or furnaces, but who controlled the flow of capital across the nation. At the center of that financial world stood one figure, John Pierpont Morgan. If Carnegie was the industrial brain of America, Morgan was its financial spine, and their collision was inevitable. But to understand why Morgan approached Carnegie and not the other way around, have to understand what Carnegie had become by the turn of the century. Carnegie Steel wasn't just profitable. It wasn't just efficient. It wasn't just massive. It had become something far rarer, a perfectly integrated organism built around a single, coherent intelligence. Morgan could merge railroads, banks, insurance firms, and electrical companies. But he could not replicate the economic logic of Carnegie Steel. That logic existed only inside one man's mind. Morgan understood this, and it infuriated him. While he bought up companies and assembled financial empires, Carnegie continued to modernize, reorganize, and expand with a speed that no conglomerate could match. Carnegie's mills were not simply assets. They were extensions of his personal philosophy shaped daily by his obsession with cost, efficiency, and technological progress. You couldn't buy that mindset. You couldn't hire it. You couldn't imitate it. You could only acquire the man or the empire he created. And Carnegie for the first time in his life, was beginning to feel something he had rarely felt before: exhaustion. He was in his mid-60s. His managers, especially Hendrick, were locked in brutal internal conflicts that drained him emotionally. The pressure of running the largest steel operation on earth was beginning to outweigh the thrill of building it. And perhaps most importantly, the personal philosophy he called the gospel of wealth was pulling him in another direction. He believed that the rich had a moral duty to give away their fortunes during their lifetimes, but as long as he remained in control of Carnegie Steel, the empire would consume him. Morgan sensed this vulnerability, and he acted with perfect timing. In 1900, he began constructing a vision of a unified steel trust, a single corporation so large, so integrated, so financially powerful that it could dominate steel production for a generation. But his vision had a fatal flaw. There was no version of that trust that could succeed without Carnegie Steel at its core. And there was no version of Carnegie Steel that could be purchased without Carnegie himself agreeing. When Morgan finally approached Carnegie with the possibility of selling, the interaction became one of the legendary moments in American business history. Carnegie didn't negotiate. He didn't posture. He didn't demand meetings or lawyers or conditions. He simply wrote a number on a slip of paper, a number so vast for the time that it seemed almost surreal. Morgan looked at it and said, "Mr. Carnegie, I accept this price." And in that moment, the logic that had driven Carnegie since boyhood finally reached its conclusion. Every decision, every reinvestment, every furnace rebuilt, every cost reduced, every risk taken, it had all led here. A lifetime of discipline transformed into the largest industrial acquisition the world had ever seen. Carnegie walked away not just wealthy, but liberated. When the deal was finalized in 1901, Andrew Carnegie walked away from the negotiating table with a fortune so large that it eclipsed anything the world had seen from a single industry. Adjusted for today, it was the equivalent of nearly $400 billion. But what mattered most wasn't the number. It was the logic that produced it, the same logic that had guided him from his earliest days as a penniless immigrant boy in Pittsburgh. After selling Carnegie Steel to J.P. Morgan, the new corporation was renamed United States Steel, and it instantly became the first company in history valued at over $1 billion. Morgan took the commanding seat. Carnegie left with a pen, a signature, and the greatest exit in American business history. But Carnegie's story did not end there. In fact, this is where the second half of his philosophy emerges, the part most people quote but few truly understand. The man who built the most efficient industrial machine on earth now redirected all his discipline, all his strategic clarity, and all his obsession with long-term thinking towards something entirely different, giving his fortune away. And this is where the logic behind his empire reveals its final layer. Carnegie did not believe that wealth existed to be accumulated. He believed it existed to be deployed. To him, money was simply frozen potential, and it was the moral duty of the rich to unfreeze that potential before they died. His famous 1889 essay, The Gospel of Wealth, declared that the best way to use riches was to improve society in ways that could not be done by governments or ordinary individuals. The same mind that optimized steel mills now optimized philanthropy. He funded libraries, more than 2,500 of them, because he believed that reading was the great equalizer of opportunity. He built universities, teacher pension systems, music halls, scientific research institutions, and foundations that shaped the future long after his death. He approached philanthropy with the same ruthless efficiency that built his mills. He didn't simply donate. He engineered impact. Here is the deeper truth about Andrew Carnegie. He lived his entire life as a man building systems. Steel was a system. Mills were a system. Costs were a system. Organizations were systems. Even philanthropy was a system. And once he learned how to master systems, becoming wealthy was no longer surprising. It was inevitable. Historians sometimes debate whether Carnegie was a visionary or a ruthless capitalist. The truth is, he was both, and far more complex than those labels allow. He was a builder of structures, industrial, intellectual, and moral, that continue to influence the modern world. Skyscrapers stand because of his steel innovations. Public libraries exist in thousands of cities because of his wealth. Research institutions still advance science because of his endowments. His logic didn't just create a fortune, it created infrastructure for civilization. And that is why studying Carnegie is so valuable. His success was not an accident or a miracle. It was the result of a consistent pattern of thinking, one built on information, bottlenecks, cost control, reinvestment, and long-term logic. If you understand how Carnegie thought, you understand how one of the greatest fortunes in history was built molecule by molecule, decision by decision. You understand how steel became an empire, and how an empire became a legacy.